fáilte a bhfuil an nacht. Ag í ar speisialta was a céimithe a lug an bailú le chéile agus céileoíanna ar an áit or eiliúid. First of all, it was 1988. And secondly, can I just say my daughter objects strongly to the use of the word veteran in the description of me in the invitation that went out. But honestly, it's a real pleasure to be speaking with you all tonight. Some faces I know, some I don't. But it's also a real privilege to be asked to speak about university, because it gives you a chance to go back and think, what the hell did I do there? I spent 4 years in university in Galway, 4 of the best years of my life, of course. But when it actually comes to thinking, what did I do? What stood out? It's like a movie. What scenes do I remember? What character was I in that scene, etc.? And I'll tell you honestly the things that came to mind when I thought of, right, what stills are stuck there in my memory. I did zoology, and part of zoology was that we would go and do dissections. So it could be a frog, a rabbit, a leech, or whatever. But one day we were doing a chicken. We were on birds at the time. And I remember coming into the lab over in Block C. We didn't have the fancy Martin Lofton thing in my day. And there sitting on my bench, for 33 of us, was a hen. When I say a hen, I mean the hen, feathers and all. Feet, beak, head, etc. And we said, Jesus, we probably have to pluck. Oh, it's the real deal. I suppose you have to dissect it. Fair enough. And I put my hand on the hen, and it was warm.
Oh no.
And I was turning around to ask the rest of my classmates, anybody else's hen warm? Yeah. When mine just went, oh. And I called Jimmy, the lab, and I said, Jimmy, the hen's alive. He said, no problem, Cilian, I'll sort it out. I said, yeah, thanks, get me another one. Not at all. He said, hold on to it. And he comes over with a glass of chloroform, sticks the beak in and says, they don't always go the first time, you have to. In microbiology, I remembered the shock when I found that the chicken we were testing for salmonella, straight out of Dublin that day, had 28 times the allowed number of salmonella. And I suppose the greatest breakthrough I made was figuring out that I probably had more odds of winning the lotto than ever succeeding at statistics. In fact, I don't know if any of you have this dream, but it's a recurring nightmare. I wake up still with an exam 2 weeks ahead, and I just don't know, I don't have the time to learn, but worse, I know I don't deserve to pass because I didn't do the work. And the other thing I remember is that we used to get phoned at home twice a day at least, asking us for UCG, because the number for UCG was 24411 and ours was 21144. But the funny thing about it was, no matter how often you told them they rang the wrong number, they said, I know, but could you still put me through? And then there were the bigger scenes. There was the basement. I loved the basement. I was one of those people who hung out there. And just all manner of life had passed by you, going to the canteen or up to lectures. But I remember, we're in a recession now, we are. And we were in a recession then. Although for some reason, and I don't know if it was a romance of youth, it just didn't feel like it. But I knew it was, because I remember sitting there one evening, and there was a coffee machine over here, and you'd have to put 20p in to get a coffee. And then the ladies' toilet was out back that way behind the stairs, and the phone, the pay phone where you'd ring home was over there. But I remember one time sitting there, and it was almost like an apocalypse. One fella with his hand so far up a coffee machine, he was bleeding, trying to get free coffee. Behind him were a bunch of girls with out a sack of toilet rolls, taking them home to their flat, and over in the corner some fella on the payphone tapping like that. So we got by. Now, of course, the backdrop was the keys, the saw doctors, all that wonderful thing that Galway gave us, which I know we all appreciate, was not just the campus, it was the beautiful way that campus is in the centre of something vibrant. Now, all the memories I have of UCG are wrapped in a story, and that's really what I want to talk to you about today. Because I can't think of a picture without thinking of the story that went with it. And these are the things that enrich our lives. These are the threads that we weave our life from. And it's something that I've just become passionately involved with in my work over the past 15 years. And that's what we are here. We're a story. We all passed through one threshold together. That was the threshold of university. We shared that at different times, in different ways, doing different subjects. But that's what a story is. It is something we all share, but have a personal relationship to. And that's the magic of an evening like this, and the magic of the evening that or the time of year we're heading into. In Connemara, listening to Colin Morty-Keane, who you have in your archive, was the first place I came across stories. And my passion in them was ignited at about 5 to 6 years old, not necessarily by the story, but the effect the story was having on the people who were listening. I could see us just escape the room when he invented somewhere that the young King of Ireland was wandering to get the cauldron or the maiden or whatever his quest was. And then in television later with RTE, I saw the power of a well-told story on the Late Late Show. With T.G. Cahill, I knew we had a harder job, telling stories in a language not so many understood, so we had to create a new type of television there. And now in my work, that's what I do with companies now, asking them what story do they believe, what story is the story of their future, and how are we changing the story as the life on site of all the people here. Precisely. We think, we remember, and we dream in stories. It's the language of humanity. Sartre once said, he said, man is a teller of tales. He lives surrounded by his stories and the stories of others. He sees everything that happens to him through them. And he lives his own life as if he were living the story. And that starts the second we're able to think for ourselves, watch our kids, dressing up, becoming someone, mimicking someone, wanting to hear Cinderella, wanting to hear Jack and the Beanstalk. Why do we tell them that? Because it helps them make sense of what they're feeling. It helps them give expression to the feelings they're having as they become humans. That was this function of stories in all of humanity, to help us express this weird relationship we have with our own experience. Take the story of Oisín agus Níamh in Celtic mythology, in the Fionnacht. Do you know that story where Oisín was out and he met this beautiful woman who promised to take him to the land of the ever young? Do you know why they used to tell that story to people? It was to do with the midlife crisis. There will always be a blonde who'll tell you, come with me, what you like to all the mountains as you were. So they had a function, the same as the story we're entering into now had a function, Christmas. In the dark of winter, something to give light. In the coldness of winter, something to feel warm. Every society at the beginning of time has had a festival around this time. Ours is the Christian version. But it's so potent that we now spend, I think, about 1/5 of the year preparing for and having Christmas. And the potency of it, of course, is given to us by two huge characters in that story. The character of Santa Claus. Last summer I was down in where Santa Claus began, way back before the Council of Nicaea. He was the Bishop of Myra from a place called Patara in Turkey. And he was generous to children and used to give dowries to women who would never get married without his gift. And the story had a huge power, this just generosity of one person. And it was taken up by the Dutch. It died in most places during the Reformation, but the Dutch kept it. The Dutch took it over to America. And they kept it there in their own religion until it filtered out. And like anywhere there's energy, commerce will find it. And the Santa we have today was actually created by Coca-Cola in 1931. I'm not saying it's terrible, it's energy, it's still as magic as it ever was. And who knows where that image will be in 100 years' time. Of course, the other story is Christ. Again, a powerful story of someone who came in the dark to give us light, to teach us how to live. Now Christ, we all know, wasn't the only guy doing this at the time, but he had the best PR. He had St. Paul. They beat the Mitrians, and Christ was the victor of that. I was in Israel a few years ago for Christmas. I took my father. And one of the nicest masses I was ever at was the Mass, Christmas Eve Mass in Jerusalem, where we must remember only 2% of all Israel is Christian. So it was a lonely Arab and the two Irishmen. But it was stunning. And the next morning we went to Bethlehem, and again, not much of a crowd, nothing special. But to walk there, and this is the thing about stories, they are that which is not. It doesn't matter. When Richard Dawkins talks about it, there's a God, who cares? There's belief. And when you walk that land of Israel and you walk up to Capernaum and to Cana and to Nazareth, you can't help but be entranced by the power of the story told 2,000 years ago. And the magic of Christ and the magic of Santa Claus, our benevolent Father, have created this whole world that we seemingly rational beings will throw ourselves into for the next 2 weeks, and it'll give us such joy to get us through that dark part of winter. And just speaking on commerce, rushing to find that energy, I thought the best one of that was in Anne Summers, where they had, "Oh, come all ye faithful," to sell their own toys. Stories shape us. They're almost intrinsic in us, almost like a love for music. We understand stories. Love of music. A bum note is a bum note wherever you go. A chord is a chord wherever you go. The same with stories. They spark off pre-existing needs of the human being. And I've discovered, there's a lot of people who classify stories. They spend their lives classifying them. What are they? Myths or folk tales, etc. And then they fall into 5 basic types. Basic types. Nearly every story told will fall into a type of story. Most important, I suppose, in a lot of our lives is the boy meets girl. The story of union. The story of 2 things coming together to enhance the other. The story of the sum being greater than the parts. Will and Kate. We saw how the world went into a frenzy. The story of the Queen and Mary McAleese. Just that coming together of 2 things to make something much bigger. And I was thinking about it today at the funeral of Paddy O'Shea, because the day he walked onto a GAA pitch, it's true to say that a beautiful love story was born that enhanced the other. Others are more fraught. Labour and Fine Gael. You can imagine that marriage being made in a laboratory somewhere. It's got that terse, tense, tight-lipped relationship that you often see on Valentine's Day. Those tables of sad people that make us lonely. James Riley and the HSE. But I think the most beautiful story, the love story of the present doll, is Mick and Ming. By the way, I knew Mick or Ming back in college. That's when he was worth knowing, let me tell you. Overcoming the Monsters, the second story. We're all aware of Godzilla. We're all aware of these monsters that come to destroy us. Jack and the Beanstalk. The strength little Jack felt in overcoming that monster, but of course we know the real meaning was the strength he found in himself. But look at the monsters that we face today in society. And look at maybe who we are to react to them. We had a monster in this place for a long time. We had the famine. And that's what monsters do. They seep through the land, taking you out. The recession, obesity, alcohol, drugs, suicide, and probably the biggest monster of all, negativity. Because negativity feeds all the other monsters. And as long as we have Joe Duffy ready to stir up any slumbering monster, don't worry, we'll always have it. It's a powerful one, that. And the opposite one might be rags to riches, which is the third form of story. And that is the belief that inside all of us is a prince or a princess, a butterfly or a bloom. Or as Kevin Nolan once said about the Cultural Revival, that although we may now be in the mire, we were once great, we were taller than Roman spears. The Ugly Duckling, Pretty Woman, Trinny and Susanna, Gok Wan, Bill Cullen. All rags to riches stories, and one of the greatest Christmas stories, A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge finds his own beauty, the better man inside himself, through the ghosts of Christmas past. And you'd ask yourself now, are we trying as Ireland to live a rags to riches story? Do we believe, as Douglas Hyde once said, that we could become again what we were of yore, one of the most original, artistic, literary and charming people of Europe? And it was a brave man that said that then, because it's planting that one seed of hope in what you see around maybe a sea of despair. One that the Irish love is the David versus Goliath story. We love an underdog. This is a story we all have a relationship. Probably that one that was told often in this very building. Probably one that defined the birth of our nation. And also deeper, landlord and tenant, poacher and gamekeeper. So who are the Goliaths of today? Who are we fighting? The markets, Germany, bondholders. Michael O'Leary lives his passion of the David and Goliath fight. He always wants to take on somebody bigger. And in that argument we forget that actually he's the biggest of them all. but possibly the one that we all understand, and maybe is the most simple story narrative arc, is the quest. That search. That search that begins the second you're born and probably doesn't end till you die. The search for meaning, the search for understanding, the search for belonging. This is poor Frodo heading off to Mordor. This is the explorer. This is the scientist seeking the cure. But it's our collective search. And that's what we need to remember in this time of gloom, and it's what I'm reminded of when I think that, I was talking to Jim earlier on, he was talking about the great things. The university has changed. As this country keeps on going, we have grown. And despite all that happened to us, we're better off today, and the kids that are leaving today are better off than we were when we were there. We have infrastructure, we have peace in the north. Two great gifts that actually we didn't have when I was graduating from there, and we have to remember that. And I think that remembering that we're in a quest of reimagination the whole time. And that was the power of the cultural revival. Because before we had sovereignty at all, they imagined it. Before we even gave ourselves the dignity or the nobility of allowing ourselves to be people, they saw it. And they threw it out there. Yeats, Gregory, Lamb, Henry, all there for us to see if we open our eyes to it. How people imagined a country way beyond their means. But what they did was they went back. They went back and they said, we might be here today, but what have we got to build on? What's behind us? Why should we believe? What are the reasons to believe? And Yeats himself said, of all the many things the past bequeaths to the future, the greatest of all are its legends. Have not all nations had their first unity from the mythology that marries them to rock and hill? We don't own this country, we're passing through. You only have to go 40 miles out the road to see the true age, grandeur, splendour of this country that we are inhabiting for a short breath. But it is our duty to try and keep it in a better state than we found it, and to pass it on in a better way than we found it. And part of that way is not just the monetary value of it. I was reading a quote today by William Blake: when nations grow old, the arts grow cold, and commerce settles on every tree. And you'd swear sometimes we were living in a bank. You'd swear sometimes we were living in a balance sheet, and that's all that mattered at the end of the day. I don't want the graduates that are in UCG today. I heard somebody last night on television say, when I look at young people, I only see immigration. That's not fair. That's not fair to what the young people in this country are doing today. And we have to be careful what story we are telling and weaving that they are growing into. As I said, we were poor in college, but nobody told me we didn't have anything. We had the world. If you had £2 in your pocket and the way into town, you had the world. So how do we see this country? I heard her called a failed state. Anybody been to Syria recently? Anybody been to Libya? We all travel. We see what the world goes through on a daily basis. And then we come back here and we see what people have given us and what we're doing with it. My mother told a story on her 70th birthday, which surprised me because my mother could sometimes be as negative as the rest of them. But on her 70th birthday, she stood, as I'm standing now, with her friends and family around her. And she said, people often ask, what was the greatest thing in your life? And she said, I could tell them it was my time in Jerusalem or my time back in Trinity or this, that, and the other shit. But no, like any mother will say, it is my children. I'm so glad that they're friends with each other. I'm so glad that they work hard. I'm so glad that they play hard. But the playing hard growing up, she said, could be a bit of a problem because they were fond of partying. And when kids go out and they party, anything could happen. And you wouldn't know what they'd do wrong and that they might get into trouble. But she said, I always knew no matter what trouble they got into, the policeman that would find them wouldn't carry a gun. I always knew that when my sons came 18, they wouldn't be taken to war. I always knew that when my daughters were 18, they would have a vote the same as my sons. I knew when they got into media, it was a free and fair media. And I knew the society they were growing up in was a democracy. And she said, for that, I'm probably in 5% of mothers in the world, and for that, I'm grateful. So that's how she chooses to see it. And that gift is in all of us, how we choose to see time we're at, the country we're in, and the story we're telling. The story we are writing. The story we are characters in. And a man called A. O'Shaughnessy said back in 1867, when the thinking of what this country was at a crucial stage, he just reminded the artists, the thinkers, those lucky enough to have education. He reminded us that we are the music makers, we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers and sitting by desolate streams. World losers and world forsakers, on whom the pale moon gleams, yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. The world is as we think it is. The world is the story we're telling ourselves. And it's only a story. It passes. It has chapters. But let's not make it a plot. Let's not look for a hero and a villain all the time. Let's just be part of the story, be the character we're supposed to be in it, and pass that story on to our children. Chorte is linne scéal a ancient hain. Tí chud cínsa gurmud inchach le gar ngasúd. Maidir brodú asin gus meidir dóchas ó bhéna. Bích nolig intach a bhégus gur míle bach
I think when I say that Cilian held his audience in the palm of his hand, I'm not exaggerating. I just hope that somebody can find inspiration to nominate a speaker for next year who can match that. Yeah.